Tonight's story begins a very long time ago. Before the first stone circles were raised on the windswept ridges of the north, a quiet world existed under the grey skies of the Scottish Highlands. The land itself has kept the memory of that time. It is preserved in the cold, wet earth, sealed beneath layers of peat that have been growing for thousands of years. We are only just beginning to look down. Before we travel deeper into this quiet, buried history together, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you find comfort in these slow stories of the past. I would also love to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below. It helps this small channel more than you might think, and it is always nice to see where these stories travel. For now, let the room go dark. If you have a fan, turn it on and let its steady, gentle sound fill the space. Make yourself comfortable. Let your body settle into the blankets and let the day drift away. The story of the ancient North has been waiting in the silence for a very long time to be told. To understand what lies hidden beneath the heather, we must first look at the story we have been told. For generations, the textbooks have described a simple beginning for this island, a story of late arrivals and slow development. But the earth itself tells a different tale. For many decades, the story of how human beings settled the island of Britain was told in a series of neat, predictable chapters. The textbooks described a cold land slowly populated in waves after the ice sheets retreated into the northern seas. In this orthodox account, the earliest inhabitants were small bands of hunter-gatherers who wandered through southern forests, leaving behind little more than scattered stone tools and temporary hearths. These people were viewed as a prelude to the real history, a simple introduction before the arrival of a more organized way of life. Around 6,000 years ago, the narrative claimed that a new wave of settlers arrived from continental Europe, bringing with them the seeds of agriculture, the domestic animals of the farm, and the knowledge of building in stone. These farmers were believed to have started from a clean slate, clearing wild woods to establish permanent villages and raising the monuments that still dot the countryside. It was a comfortable story. It placed every event in a logical order, suggesting a steady march from simple survival to the complex societies of the Middle Ages. The past was organized, yet, when one travels north into the cold valleys and high moors of Scotland, the comfortable narrative begins to fall apart. Scotland has long been the awkward corner of the British Isles for archaeologists who prefer neat timelines. The climate is damp and unpredictable, the winters are long, and the soil is thin. According to the standard models, this northern tip of the island should have been a peripheral zone where new ideas arrived last and developed most slowly. The early farmers should have stayed in the sunnier, more fertile south, only sending small groups into the north when land became scarce. But the physical evidence left in the ground shows the exact opposite. Instead of a sparse frontier, the northern landscape holds a density of prehistoric structures that is almost unmatched anywhere else in Europe. The hills and coastlines are crowded with stone circles, chambered cairns, round towers, and ancient settlements that seem too large and too complex for the populations that supposedly lived there. These structures are not late copies of southern designs. Many of them are older, built at a time when the South was still largely empty of stone architecture. The edge of the map was actually the center. This dense concentration suggests that prehistoric inhabitants were far more organized than old models allowed. One cannot walk a mile in the highlands without encountering the remnants of this old world. There are stone circles in the heather, long earthen mounds marking burials, and heaps of fire-cracked stones near streams. In the far north and on the islands, these structures are everywhere. They are built of massive granite blocks and local sandstone, dragged across the hills and set into the earth with a precision that has allowed them to stand for thousands of years. The sheer volume of labor required to build these monuments is difficult to calculate. It would have required the cooperation of hundreds of people, working together over seasons and years, clearing land, quarrying stone, and coordinating supply lines. This is not the work of small, isolated family groups wandering the woods in search of food. It represents a settled, stable society with a deep connection to specific places and a shared vision that stretched across generations. The buildings outlasted the builders. To understand the scale of this miscalculation, one must look at the stone circle of Callanish on the Isle of Lewis. Standing on a low ridge overlooking the dark waters of Loch Rogue, the monument consists of a central circle of tall, thin stones with avenues of smaller stones stretching to the north, south, east, and west. The stone is a local gneiss, gray and white, with veins of quartz that catch the pale northern light. When early antiquarians first drew the circle in the 17th and 18th centuries, they assumed it was a relatively late monument, perhaps built around the same time as Stonehenge, or even during the late Bronze Age. It was assumed that the knowledge of such construction had traveled slowly from the south, reaching the remote outer islands only after centuries of cultural drift. For a long time, this date was accepted without question, because it fit the comfortable story of waves moving north. The stones stood in silence, keeping their secrets. However, the development of modern scientific dating techniques changed everything. During excavations in the mid-20th century, archaeologists recovered organic material from the stone holes and central tomb. When this material was tested, results surprised the academic world. The earliest phases of the Callanish complex did not belong to the late Bronze Age, nor were they contemporary with the main building phase of Stonehenge. Instead, the evidence showed that the central stone circle was raised around 3000 BC. This date makes Callanish at least 1,000 years older than the stone circles of southern England. The monument was already ancient, weathered by centuries of Atlantic storms, when the first ditch at Stonehenge was being dug. It was a place of ritual and astronomical observation long before the pyramids of Egypt were conceived. This single discovery broke the old timeline, forcing researchers to accept that the northern islands were home to a highly organized society at a time when the south was still in the early stages of the agricultural transition. The margins were leading the way. The implications of the Callanish dates stretch far beyond the Isle of Lewis. If a complex monument of stone and earth could be built on a remote western island 5,000 years ago, it means the traditional view of prehistoric Britain is incorrect. It suggests that the knowledge of stone architecture did not travel north in a slow wave from the continent. Instead, it may have developed independently in the north, or even traveled south from the islands to the mainland. The outer edge of the island was not a barren outpost, but a hub of innovation. This realization has forced a complete reassessment of the resources and organization of these ancient communities. Building Callanish was a massive undertaking. The stones are up to 5 meters tall, weighing several tons each, and they had to be quarried, transported over rough ground, and erected without metal tools. Such an effort requires a surplus of food to support the workers, a shared belief system to motivate them, and a stable social structure to plan the work. The old picture of isolated farmers struggling to survive in a harsh environment is no longer tenable. They were builders of the highest order. Callanish is not an isolated case. Across the mainland of Scotland, particularly in the northern counties of Caithness and Sutherland, similar anomalies have been appearing in the archaeological record for over a century. There are circles of stone, alignments that stretch across the moors, and mounds that cover stone chambers. Many of these sites have never been properly excavated, and their dates remain uncertain, but the work that has been done consistently points toward an early and highly organized presence. The landscape itself seems to be saturated with the remains of this early era. In some valleys, the ruins of multiple periods are layered on top of one another, showing that the same locations were chosen again and again over thousands of years. The soil is thick with the debris of ancient lives, yet, because these sites are remote and difficult to access, they have often been left out of the national stories, treated as local curiosities rather than key pieces of the British past. The silence of the Highlands has kept these secrets well. This brings us back to the central problem of prehistory in the North. If the standard models are wrong, what is the true story of how people lived here? To find the answer, we must look beyond the standing stones that remain visible on the surface. We must look at what lies beneath the ground, at the layers of soil and organic material that have accumulated since the monuments were built. The landscape of Scotland is not a static stage, but a living archive that has been actively collecting and preserving evidence for thousands of years. The cold climate, the heavy rainfall, and the geology of the hills have combined to create a unique environment where the past is not lost, but sealed away. It is an archive made of wet earth and slow-growing moss, and it is within this damp, quiet archive that the physical evidence of an older, more sophisticated Scotland is waiting. The story is there, written in the soil. The search for this hidden history must begin at a quiet site on the northeast coast of Scotland, not far from the modern town of Stonehaven. Here, in a field known as Warren Field, a discovery was made that shook the very foundations of British archaeology. In 2004, a team of researchers was conducting an excavation before the construction of a new pipeline. They expected to find typical agricultural remains from recent centuries, or perhaps a simple boundary ditch from the Middle Ages. Instead, as they cleared the topsoil, they exposed a series of large, deep pits dug into the subsoil, arranged in a long, curving line that stretched for nearly 50 meters across the landscape. The pits were circular, several meters wide, and filled with dark soil that contained charcoal and fragments of burned wood. At first, the researchers assumed these were simple storage pits or post holes from a Neolithic or Bronze Age settlement, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years old. It was a reasonable assumption. It fit the standard models of when people in Britain first began to modify the landscape on a significant scale. However, when the carbon samples from the bottom of the pits were sent to the laboratory for analysis, the dating results left the excavation team in disbelief. The charcoal did not date to the Bronze Age, nor did it belong to the early farmers of the Neolithic. The dates came back at approximately 10,000 years ago, placing the construction of the pits firmly in the Mesolithic period, around 8,000 BC. This was a time when Britain was occupied by the very hunter-gatherers whom the textbooks had described as simple nomads. These people were supposed to be wandering the forests, living day to day, and leaving no permanent mark on the earth. Yet, here was evidence of a massive engineering project, requiring the excavation of tons of earth and gravel, carried out thousands of years before the first farm was established in northern Europe. The old narrative was broken. The true significance of Warrenfield became clear only when researchers began to analyze the spatial arrangement of the 12 pits. They realized the pits were not dug at random. They were arranged in a precise arc that matched the movement of the moon across the sky. Each of the 12 pits represented a specific lunar month, creating a physical calendar that allowed the builders to track the passage of time throughout the seasonal year. The system was designed to mirror the phases of the moon, from the thin crescent of the new moon to the full disk and back to darkness. This was a discovery of extraordinary complexity. To design and build such a system, the Mesolithic hunters must have possessed a detailed understanding of lunar cycles, observing the sky over many years and recording their observations in memory before translating them into stone and timber. The calendar was a tool of survival. Tracking the moon, however, presents a serious problem for any calendar builder. A lunar year, consisting of 12 lunar months, is about 11 days shorter than the solar year, which is determined by the Earth's orbit around the Sun. If a calendar tracks only the moon, the months will slowly drift out of alignment with the seasons. A month that begins in winter will eventually drift into autumn, then summer, making the calendar useless for predicting the natural cycles of migration and plant growth. To keep the calendar accurate, the builders needed a way to reset the system, to realign the lunar months with the solar year. The builders of Warrenfield solved this problem with remarkable sophistication. They aligned the arc of the pits with a specific point on the eastern horizon, where the sun rises on the winter solstice. The surrounding hills and ridges acted as a natural sightline on the horizon. This alignment meant that once a year, on the shortest day, the rising sun would shine directly down the valley, lighting up the end of the pit alignment. If the lunar calendar had drifted out of step, the solstice sunrise provided an unmistakable signal to reset the system. This process of correction shows a level of astronomical knowledge that was previously thought to be impossible for hunter-gatherers. It implies a tradition of observation that must have existed for centuries before the pits were dug. To notice the slight shifts in the sun's position and to correct for them in a permanent structure requires a culture that valued long-term planning and shared knowledge. These people were not merely reacting to their environment, they were measuring it. The architecture of the calendar itself deserves a closer look. The pits were not simple holes in the ground. They were carefully designed with varying depths and profiles, suggesting that they may have held wooden posts of different heights or shapes, perhaps representing different stages of the moon's cycle. When the moon was high in the sky, its light would have fallen into the pits at different angles, creating a play of light and shadow that could be read by the observers. The labor required to dig these pits through the tough glacial gravel of Aberdeenshire was immense. It would have required tools made of red deer antler and wooden shovels, and the coordination of a community that was willing to invest its time and energy into a project that had no immediate practical use. This was a monument built for the mind and the spirit, a physical anchor for their understanding of the cosmos. The discovery of Warrenfield challenges the fundamental idea that monument building and complex timekeeping were developments that arrived only with agriculture. The standard historical narrative has long argued that farming was the catalyst for all complex human activity. According to this view, Once people settled in one place and began to grow crops, they gained a surplus of food and a stable social structure, which in turn allowed them to study the sky, build monuments, and develop organized belief systems. But Warren Field reverses this order. The calendar was built by people who did not farm, who did not live in permanent villages, and who still moved through the landscape with the seasons. It suggests that the intellectual capacity and social organization required for complex projects were already present in the Mesolithic. The need to organize time and coordinate gatherings came before the plow. The construction of Warren Field was not a one-time effort. Archaeological evidence shows that the site was used and maintained for thousands of years. The pits were periodically recut and cleared of debris, and the posts that stood within them were replaced as the timber rotted. The dates of use span a period of nearly 4,000 years, showing that the calendar was maintained from the Mesolithic all the way into the Neolithic period. This represents an extraordinary continuity of tradition. It means that the knowledge of the calendar, its astronomical alignments, and its ritual significance was passed down through 100 generations of people. The community that cared for Warren Field had a deep sense of history and a commitment to preserving their inheritance. The site remained active across millennia. If such a complex calendar could be maintained for 4,000 years in the Northeast, it raises a significant question about what else might be hidden in the northern landscape. Warren Field was discovered only because a pipeline was being built. It left no visible trace on the surface, and the field had been plowed for centuries without anyone suspecting what lay beneath. The surrounding highlands contain thousands of valleys and hillsides that have never been disturbed by modern development, and where the peat is deep enough to cover even larger structures. The potential for finding similar ancient structures across this wild landscape is immense. It suggests that the history of early Scotland is not a story of isolated hunters living in a wilderness, but of an organized people who were actively measuring their world and marking it with permanent monuments. The silent fields of the north are holding their breath, waiting for the spade. To understand how these ancient traditions of observation took physical form in stone, one must travel to the outer edge of the Scottish Islands, to the west coast of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. Here, on a low ridge of wind-swept moorland overlooking the tidal waters of Loch Rogue, stands the monument complex of Callanish. The landscape is flat and wide, dominated by the peat plains and the giant sky that seems to stretch forever in every direction. In this exposed place, where the wind from the Atlantic is a constant presence, a group of ancient builders created one of the most sophisticated megalithic monuments in northern Europe. Unlike the simple stone circles found in other parts of Britain, Callanish is laid out in a complex cruciform pattern. At its center stands a circle of 13 tall, thin stones of Lewisian gneiss, a metamorphic rock that is among the oldest in the world. This stone is textured and layered, colored in shades of gray, white, and pink, and catch the shifting light of the northern sun. At the center of this circle stands a single, massive monolith, nearly 5 meters tall, rising like a frozen sentinel against the sky. From this central circle, lines of standing stones stretch out in 4 directions. A long, double row of stones forms a grand avenue that runs almost directly north, leading the eye toward the horizon. Shorter, single lines of stones extend to the south, east, and west, forming the arms of the Great Stone Cross. The layout is precise, showing that the builders were working from a deliberate plan, rather than setting stones at random over generations. The avenue is particularly striking, consisting of 19 stones on the eastern side and 9 on the western side, creating a pathway that seems to invite the observer to approach the central circle from the north. The stones vary in height, with the tallest placed near the center and the smaller ones at the outer ends of the arms, creating a sense of movement and perspective that is unique in megalithic architecture. The builders created a sanctuary of stone. Within the central circle, tucked beside the tall central monolith, is the ruin of a small chambered tomb. This tomb was built after the stone circle was already standing, showing that the monument served multiple purposes over its long history. It was a temple for the living and a house for the dead. Archaeologists excavating the tomb found fragments of cremated human bone, suggesting that the site was used for the burial of select members of the community, perhaps the leaders or priests, who held the astronomical knowledge required to maintain the calendar. The presence of the tomb inside the circle suggests a close connection between the ancestors, the stone monument, and the movements of the sky. The dead were placed where the sun and the moon would shine on them at specific times of the year, connecting their memory to the eternal cycles of the cosmos. The tomb was a bridge. The astronomical alignments of Callanish are among the most precise and complex of any prehistoric monument. While many stone circles track the solstices or the equinoxes, Callanish appears to have been designed primarily to observe the moon. Specifically, the monument is aligned to track a rare and complex lunar cycle known as the Major Lunar Standstill. This event occurs only once every 19 years, when the moon reaches its maximum declination, rising and setting at its most extreme positions on the horizon. During a major lunar standstill, the moon rises very low in the southern sky, appearing to skim along the tops of the mountains to the south. From the perspective of an observer standing in the northern avenue of Callanish, the moon appears to walk along the ridge of the distant hills before setting directly into the central circle. The hills form the silhouette of a sleeping woman. This southern hill range, known locally as the Sleeping Beauty due to its resemblance to a reclining figure, plays an essential role in the lunar drama. As the moon reaches its lowest point during the standstill, it seems to touch the head of the figure, then glide along the body before disappearing behind the hills. The visual effect is both beautiful and mysterious, creating a link between the shape of the earth and the movements of the sky. For the prehistoric watchers, this was not a dry astronomical exercise. It was a sacred event, a moment when the Earth Mother herself seemed to receive the light of the moon. The placement of the stones at Callanish was chosen with extraordinary care to ensure this specific alignment was visible from within the sanctuary, aligning the human world with the cosmic dance. This relationship between the stones, the moon, and the landscape is too precise to be accidental. The builders did not choose the site of Callanish simply because it was a flat ridge. They chose it because it was the exact position from which this lunar phenomenon could be observed in all its clarity. If the monument had been built even a few hundred meters to the east or west, the alignment with the southern hills would have been lost. The architecture of stone was designed to frame the sky. The tall monolith at the center acts as a sightline, aligning with the northern avenue to create a long axis that points toward the setting position of the moon during the standstill. The builders were not merely tracking time. They were capturing a moment of cosmic order. To appreciate the significance of this alignment, one must understand the challenge it represents. Unlike the sun, which completes its cycle of solstices every year, the moon's cycle is long and complex. To identify the major lunar standstill requires observations spanning several decades. It requires a society with the capacity to transmit precise observation data across generations, passing the knowledge from parent to child, teacher to student. Without the aid of written records, the builders of Callanish must have possessed a formal system of memory, perhaps encoded in stories, songs, or drawings on wood and skin that allowed them to track the moon over generations. The stones of Callanish are the physical culmination of this long tradition. They represent the moment when this accumulated knowledge was permanently set in stone. Standing inside the circle on a clear winter night, the power of this design becomes visible. The Louisian gneiss, with its veins of quartz, catches the light of the stars and the moon, reflecting a soft glow that makes the stones seem almost alive. The great avenue stretches north into the darkness, pointing toward the dark horizon like a pathway into the deep cosmos. In the cold stillness of the night, with the wind blowing off the sea and the heather rustling in the dark, the connection between the earth and the sky feels immediate and real. The monument is not merely a collection of stones. It is an instrument of connection, a place where the human mind sought to align itself with the eternal movements of the universe. The builders of Callanish achieved something that goes beyond mere utility. They created a sacred space where the sky was brought down to the earth. Today, Callanish remains one of the most iconic prehistoric monuments in Europe, yet it is only the most visible part of a larger prehistoric landscape. The surrounding hills and islands contain several other stone circles, standing stones, and chambered cairns that have never been fully studied. Many of these smaller sites appear to have been deliberately aligned with Callanish, forming a network of monuments that marked the landscape and tracked the sky over a vast area. The existence of this network suggests that the society that built Callanish was not isolated on the Isle of Lewis. They were part of a larger culture that stretched across the highlands and islands, sharing a common language of stone and a shared understanding of the sky. The stones of Lewis are not isolated wonders. They are the visible peaks of a buried world. The key to unlocking the mysteries of early Scotland lies not in the monuments that still stand against the sky, but in the dark, wet depths of the peat bogs that cover much of the highlands. These bogs are often viewed as barren, empty spaces, useful only for cutting fuel or sheep grazing. Yet, to the historian and the archaeologist, they are the ultimate time capsules. The formation of peat is a slow process that occurs in cold, wet environments where the soil is permanently waterlogged. Under these conditions, dead moss and other bog plants accumulate faster than they can decay. Over thousands of years, this organic material builds up in thick layers, sometimes reaching depths of several meters. The environment within a peat bog is unique. Because the water blocks the air, there is no oxygen, and the high acidity of the moss prevents the growth of bacteria that normally break down organic matter. It is a world where decay is arrested, and time stands still. This preservation environment has produced some of the most startling discoveries in European archaeology. Organic materials that would rot and vanish in ordinary soil within a few years are preserved in the peat for millennia. Wood remains firm, fabric retains its weave, and even human bodies are preserved with such fidelity that their hair, skin, and facial expressions remain visible after thousands of years. But the preservative power of the peat stretches beyond organic objects. It preserves entire landscapes. In many parts of the highlands, the peat acts as a protective blanket, sealing beneath it the stone walls, wooden platforms, and earthworks of the people who lived here before the bogs formed. When the peat began to grow, it did not destroy what was there. It slowly rose around the structures, covering them in a layer of wet moss, and sealing them away from the air and the weather. The ancient world was preserved in a deep, wet vault. This exceptional preservation is due to the chemical makeup of the sphagnum moss that forms the bulk of the peat. As the moss dies and accumulates, it releases a compound known as sphagnum, which binds metal ions and deprives bacteria of essential nutrients. This stops the decay process. The acidic, cold water acts as a natural tanning agent, turning skin into leather and preserving soft tissues with astonishing detail. In the highlands, this means that even delicate wooden tools, baskets, and clothing that would normally decay within months have been found in near-perfect condition. These finds provide a window into the daily lives of the prehistoric people that stone monuments can never give. They show a people who were skilled in woodcarving, weaving, and leatherworking, using the resources of their environment with great skill. The bog does not just preserve structures, it preserves the texture of life itself. For centuries, the existence of these buried structures was known only to the local farmers who worked the land. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as landlords sought to improve their estates, large-scale drainage schemes were introduced across the highlands. Farmers were hired to cut deep drainage channels through the bogs to dry the land for planting or sheep pasture. As their iron spades sliced through the thick, black peat, they began to hit obstacles that did not belong in a natural bog. They found stone walls buried 3 or 4 meters deep, running in straight lines across the underlying clay. They struck thick wooden platforms made of worked timber, showing the clear marks of stone axes, preserved as fresh as if they had been cut the previous week. These discoveries were made in remote valleys, far from any modern settlements, at depths that made no sense to the people who found them. To the 19th century farmer, these finds were a mystery, but also a nuisance. The buried walls and platforms blocked their drainage channels, and removing the massive stones and heavy timbers was hard, slow work. Most of these discoveries were never reported to researchers or government officials. Instead, they were noted briefly in farm journals, mentioned in letters to family members, or discussed in the minutes of local agricultural improvement societies. Once the obstacle was removed or bypassed, the work continued, the fields were planted, and the memory of what had been found was lost. The timbers were often left on the surface to rot or used as fence posts and fuel, and the stone walls were dismantled to build new sheep pens. In this way, a vast amount of evidence of early human activity was quietly destroyed before modern archaeology even existed. The bog kept its secrets from the textbooks, yet enough of these reports survived to create a pattern that could not be ignored. When modern researchers began to compile these historical accounts and map the locations of the discoveries, they realized that the buried structures were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a vast, landscape-scale system of land division and settlement. The reports came from Caithness, Sutherland, Ross-shire, and the Western Isles, describing stone walls, enclosures, and wooden tracks buried at similar depths beneath the peat. The depth of the peat is a crucial clue. Because peat grows at a slow and relatively predictable rate, the thickness of the bog covering a structure provides a rough measure of its age. A wall buried under 3 meters of peat must have been built thousands of years ago, before the bog began to form. The evidence suggested that before the highlands became a wet, empty wilderness, they were home to a settled population that was actively managing the land. This realization has forced a complete rethinking of the relationship between early humans and the highland environment. For a long time, it was assumed that the peat bogs were a natural feature of the landscape, and that prehistoric people had simply avoided them, settling only on the drier, more fertile coastal strips. But the buried walls show that the people were there first. They were building their fields and homes on dry, fertile ground that was covered in forests of oak, pine, and hazel. The bogs came later, rising like a slow tide to cover the land and force the people out. In this view, the highland landscape is not an ancient wilderness, but a drowned landscape. The peat did not prevent settlement, it buried it. This shift in perspective is fundamental, because it means that if we want to understand the true scale of prehistoric activity in the north, we cannot limit our study to the sites that are visible today. We must look down. The challenge for modern archaeology is how to investigate this buried world without destroying it. Excavating a site buried under 3 meters of wet peat is an extraordinarily difficult and expensive task. The peat is heavy, water flows constantly into any trench, and the lack of oxygen means that once organic materials are exposed to the air, they begin to decay rapidly. A wooden platform that has survived for 5,000 years under the bog can rot and collapse within weeks if it is not treated with expensive preservatives. Because of these challenges, most of the buried landscape remains unexcavated, protected by the very peat that conceals it. The bogs remain the guardians of the past, keeping their secrets safe until new technologies allow us to see through the mud without having to dig. The silence of the moss remains unbroken. As we look out over the vast, empty moors of the highlands today, it is worth remembering what lies beneath our feet. The heather and the moss are not the original face of this land. They are a shroud covering the ruins of a lost world of fields, homes, and pathways. The people who built the walls and walked the wooden tracks were not primitive nomads struggling to survive. They were a sophisticated, organized community that had adapted to their environment and modified it on a significant scale. Their story is not lost. It is merely waiting, preserved in the dark, acidic waters of the deep bogs, keeping its secrets until we are ready to listen. The land remembers, even if we have forgotten. To find the physical proof of these hidden landscapes, one must travel to the far north of the Scottish mainland, to the wild and remote county of Sutherland. This is a region of steep, isolated mountains rising like islands from a vast sea of peat and heather. It is a landscape that feels empty, where the sheep outnumber the people, and where the silence is broken only by the wind and the cry of the birds. Yet, it is within this quiet wilderness that some of the most challenging evidence of early human activity has been found and forgotten. The story of these discoveries illustrates the difficulties that arise when the physical record does not fit the accepted historical timeline. It begins in 1976, when a survey team was mapping the peatlands of southern Sutherland. As they traversed a remote valley, they noticed a series of large stones emerging from the side of a drainage channel. The channel had been cut through a deep bog, exposing a section of peat nearly 4 meters thick. At the base of the peat, resting on the underlying clay, was a row of large stones that appeared to be deliberately arranged. The stones were aligned in an elongated pattern, forming what looked like the walls of a chamber or a narrow passage. The survey team was struck by the size of the stones and the regularity of their alignment, which did not look like the natural glacial deposition common in the area. However, because the site was remote and the peat was so deep, the team did not undertake a formal excavation. In their report, they suggested that the stones were likely a natural formation, perhaps glacially deposited boulders that happened to resemble human construction. The report was filed in a database. The site was not explored further, and the valley returned to its silence. The assumption that early people did not build in stone was enough to close the file. 13 years later, in 1989, a different survey team was working a few miles away in the same valley system. They made a similar discovery, finding another alignment of large stones buried deep beneath the peat. This time, however, the researchers examined the stones more closely. They found clear, undeniable evidence of human modification on the stone surfaces. Several of the stones showed marks of deliberate dressing, where the surfaces had been pecked and shaped to create flat faces for building. This was not a natural arrangement of glacial boulders deposited by retreating ice. It was a carefully worked stone structure, built by human hands for a specific purpose. The depth of the peat covering the stones was approximately 4 meters, the same as the 1976 site. In the damp climate of northern Scotland, a peat deposit of that thickness takes thousands of years to accumulate, placing the construction of the wall somewhere between 7 and 10,000 years ago. The nature of the 1989 site deserves closer examination. The survey team discovered that the stones were not just placed in a line. They were set into a foundation trench that had been cut into the clay subsoil, a technique that requires planning and a clear understanding of structural stability. The wall itself consisted of several large blocks of local schist, some weighing more than 100 kilograms, which must have been carried from a quarry site at the other end of the valley. The spaces between the large stones were packed with smaller gravel and earth to create a solid barrier. This level of construction detail is identical to the techniques used in the Neolithic period, yet the dating of the surrounding peat layer was clear. The structure was built when the valley was still a woodland, long before the bog existed. This date was highly problematic. It placed the construction of a permanent stone wall firmly in the Mesolithic period, a time when Britain was supposedly occupied only by small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers. According to the standard models, these hunters lived in temporary shelters made of branches and skins, and did not possess the social organization or the technical skill to quarry, dress, and build in stone. Stone architecture was supposed to be a Neolithic development, arriving only with farming thousands of years later. To suggest that hunter-gatherers in the far north of Scotland were building stone structures 10,000 years ago was to challenge the core assumptions of British archaeology. The team published their findings in a regional journal, describing the structure as anomalous and recommending further study. But the study never happened. Funding was not available, and the implications of the discovery were too uncomfortable to pursue. This pattern of discovery, followed by silence, is a common feature of Highland archaeology. When an anomalous site is found, one that does not fit the dominant historical models, it is often filed away as an anomaly and ignored. Part of this is due to the practical difficulties of working in the north. Sutherland is remote, the weather is unpredictable, and excavation is slow and expensive. But part of it is also a quiet, institutional reluctance to look too closely at evidence that might dismantle the comfortable historical frameworks that have taken generations of scholars to build. If hunter-gatherers were building in stone in Sutherland 10,000 years ago, it means the story of human progress in northern Europe is not a simple linear march from primitive nomads to civilized farmers. It suggests a more complex history, where different ways of life existed side by side, and where the capacity for organization was present much earlier than we thought. To understand what these buried walls represent, we must reject the old label of primitive that has so often been applied to Mesolithic peoples. The hunter-gatherers of Scotland were not simple savages wandering the woods in a desperate struggle for survival. They were a sophisticated and organized community with a deep understanding of their landscape and its resources. The people who aligned the stones in the Sutherland Valley had been observing the movements of the sun and the moon for generations, and they possessed the technical skill to shape granite and sandstone without metal tools. Their stone structures were not temporary shelters. They were permanent markers, built to define the landscape, establish territories, or hold ritual gatherings. They represent a society that was already modifying its environment on a significant scale, thousands of years before the arrival of agriculture. The stone walls of the north are a physical record of their skill and organization. The existence of these Mesolithic stone structures in Sutherland suggests that we have consistently underestimated the prehistoric people of Scotland. Each time a new discovery is made, we are forced to revise our estimates of their capabilities upward. The Warren Field calendar showed that they were capable of sophisticated timekeeping, and the Sutherland walls suggest they were building in stone much earlier than the textbooks predicted. These are not isolated wonders. They are the surviving traces of a continuous tradition of building and observation that stretched across the highlands and islands for thousands of years. The history of early Scotland is not a clean slate that was written on only after the arrival of farming. It is a layered archive, where each generation built upon the work of those who came before, leaving their mark in the soil and the stone. As the peat continues to grow over the empty valleys of Sutherland, the buried walls remain in the dark, preserving the evidence of this lost era. They stand in silence, waiting for the day when archaeology is ready to look down and rewrite the story of prehistoric Britain. The evidence is there, hidden beneath 4 meters of wet moss and centuries of neglect, pointing toward a history that is far older and more complex than anything we currently recognize. The dark hills of the north are holding their breath, keeping their secrets safe until the spade of the excavator returns. The story of Sutherland is not yet finished, and its most remarkable chapters may still be waiting under the moss. To see through this thick blanket of moss, without disturbing the delicate balance of the earth, requires a different kind of vision. For generations, researchers used the iron spade to search for the past, cutting through the wet peat and exposing the stones. But today, a quieter method is being used. Researchers no longer need to dig deep trenches. Instead, they walk the moors with instruments that look through the earth, revealing a world invisible for thousands of years. The empty valleys of the highlands, looking silent and wild, are anything but empty. Beneath the heather, a vast network of ancient structures is being mapped, showing that these remote lands were once home to an organized population. The wilderness is an illusion. The work is slow and methodical. A surveyor walks across the bog, boots sinking into the wet sphagnum moss with a soft, sucking sound. The air is cold and carries the smell of damp earth. Overhead, gray clouds hang low, and the wind blows steadily from the sea. In their hands, the surveyor carries a frame of light metal tubes with sensors hanging close to the ground. No heavy machinery is heard, only the occasional beep of the instrument and the steady rhythm of footsteps. Step by step, the surveyor traverses the hillside in a precise, straight-line grid. It is a quiet exercise in patience, matching the slow growth of the bog itself. One primary tool in this quiet search is ground-penetrating radar. The instrument sends high-frequency electromagnetic pulses down into the soil, traveling easily through layers of wet peat and waterlogged moss. But when the pulse encounters a change in the earth, such as a buried stone wall or a hard clay floor, the wave bounces back. A receiver detects these returning echoes, measuring the exact time they took to return. Because the speed of the wave through different materials is known, researchers can calculate the precise depth of the object. As the surveyor walks, the instrument builds a continuous profile, creating a cross-section of the earth. Another method, known as magnetometry, measures the invisible magnetic fields of the earth. The soil contains tiny particles of iron minerals, which are normally distributed at random. However, when ancient humans modified the ground, they altered these magnetic properties. A hearth where fires burned will have its iron minerals permanently realigned by the heat, creating a tiny magnetic anomaly that can be detected today. Even digging a ditch or filling a pit disturbs the natural alignment of the soil, leaving a faint magnetic signature. The magnetometers used by the survey teams are so sensitive that they can detect these minute variations, mapping the shape of buried ditches and hearths without disturbing a single leaf of heather. A third technique, electrical resistivity, uses the flow of electric current to map the subsoil. Peat is naturally wet and acidic, which makes it an excellent conductor of electricity. An electrical current passed through the bog flows easily through the waterlogged moss. However, if the current encounters a dry stone wall or a paved pathway, it meets resistance. By inserting small metal probes into the ground and passing a weak current between them, researchers measure this resistance. A map of the resistance values across a field reveals the locations of buried stone features, which appear as areas of high resistance. This method is highly effective in mapping the ancient boundaries that run beneath the moss. When these different geophysical techniques are combined, they produce a detailed digital map of what lies beneath the heather. To the casual visitor, the Highland moors appear to be a pristine wilderness, a landscape that has never been touched by the plow or divided by walls. The travel guides describe these regions as the last wild places of Britain, but the geophysical grid tells a different story. The scans show that the empty space is a modern creation, the result of centuries of depopulation and environmental change. Beneath the peat lies a landscape that was once intensively managed, divided, and settled. The screens show lines of stone walls running for miles across the hillsides, forming neat rectangular fields. The scale of these buried field systems is extraordinary. In some valleys, the stone walls do not just enclose small garden plots, but divide entire hillsides into organized territories. These walls are often built of large, unworked stones, laid out in long, straight alignments that ignore the contours of the land, climbing over ridges and descending into valleys. The geophysical scans show that these walls were not built overnight. They represent a major investment of community labor, requiring the clearing of thousands of tons of stone from the fields and the construction of barriers to keep livestock out of the crops. The fields themselves are regular in shape, suggesting a systematic division of land. Within these field systems, the scans reveal the footprints of the homes where the builders lived. These footprints appear as circular anomalies, representing the foundations of roundhouses. The circular shape is typical of prehistoric dwellings across Britain, but the number of these structures in the far north is surprising. The roundhouses are often 15 meters in diameter, with thick stone walls that supported a conical roof of thatch or turf. The scans show the locations of the entrances, which face toward the southeast to catch the rising sun and avoid the cold winds. In some settlements, the roundhouses are arranged in tight clusters, forming small villages. The geophysical maps show the hearths at the center of these homes, where fires burned 5,000 years ago. Between the fields and the villages, the instruments map the ancient pathways that connected the communities. These pathways appear as narrow strips of low resistance, where the ground was compacted by the feet of thousands of people and their animals. In some places, where the ground was particularly wet, the builders laid down wooden trackways, constructed of split logs of oak and birch, laid side by side on top of the soft earth. Although the wood has long since disappeared from the surface, the geophysical scans can still detect the outline of the trackways, showing how they crossed the wet valleys. These paths show that the prehistoric highlands were not a collection of isolated families. They were a connected society, where people traveled between valleys to trade and maintain social ties. The detail of these maps allows us to reconstruct the moment when this busy world was abandoned. The geophysical scans show that the peat did not form all at once, but grew slowly, encroaching on the fields and homes over centuries. As the climate became colder and wetter around 3,000 years ago, the soil became waterlogged, and the sphagnum moss began to spread. The scans show how the walls were slowly buried, with the lower courses of stone covered first, while the upper stones remained visible on the surface. The people did not flee in a sudden panic, but adapted as long as they could. They built their walls higher and cleared drainage ditches, but the moss was relentless. The peat sealed the landscape in its final moment of use. The density of these buried structures is a striking reminder of how much the highlands have changed. In many of the valleys where the geophysical grid has revealed dozens of roundhouses and miles of field walls, there are no modern inhabitants today. The valleys are empty, home only to red deer and birds of prey, with perhaps a sheep farm at the lower end. There are more homes buried beneath the peat in some of these glens than there are active households in the entire parish today. This realization challenges the idea of progress, showing that the carrying capacity of this land was once much higher than it is now. The ancient communities had created a stable, productive way of life that supported a significant population. As the survey work continues, the digital maps grow larger, connecting different valleys and creating a regional picture of prehistoric Scotland. The technology allows us to appreciate the scale of this ancient society without disturbing the protective blanket of the peat. The stone walls, the roundhouses, and the pathways remain safe in their cold, acidic vault. The geophysical grid has shown us that the land is not a silent wilderness, but a library of stone and timber waiting to be read. The lines on the screen are the signatures of the builders, written in the earth and revealed by the light of modern instruments. The stories are there, and they are beginning to emerge from the shadow of the moss. The shadow of the moss is not the only force that redefined this ancient world. To the south and east, a different, grander transformation was unfolding, one that would shape the geography of the north forever. This was the rising of the seas. For thousands of years, the island we know today did not exist. Instead, the land was connected to the rest of Europe by a vast plain that lay where the North Sea now rolls. This lost country, known to modern researchers as Doggerland, was once the true heart of the northern world. It was a fertile expanse of valleys, rivers, and forests, stretching from the eastern coast of Scotland all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands. The sea was far away. During the height of the last ice age, massive ice sheets locked up much of the world's water, lowering sea levels by over 100 meters. As the climate warmed and the ice began to retreat, it left behind a landscape of extraordinary richness. Doggerland was a damp, green country, watered by major rivers that combined the waters of the Thames, the Rhine, and the Elbe into a single great estuary. The land was flat, dominated by shallow lakes, reeds, and slow-moving streams. Forests of birch, pine, and hazel grew on the higher ridges, while the lowlands were filled with rich grasses. It was a paradise for wildlife, home to herds of red deer, wild horses, and even the last woolly mammoths. For the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, this plain was a land of abundance. The rivers were thick with salmon and trout, the marshes were filled with waterfowl, and the forests provided nuts and berries. The people lived in seasonal camps along the riverbanks and estuaries, moving with the migrations of the animals. They were skilled fishers and hunters, using tools of bone, antler, and flint to harvest the riches of the land. Their life was closely tuned to the rhythms of the seasons. In this low-lying world, there were no hard boundaries or isolated communities. People could walk from the hills of Yorkshire to the forests of Germany without crossing a single strip of salt water. It was a unified continent. But this rich world was temporary. As the global climate continued to warm, the vast ice sheets in the north melted, releasing billions of tons of water back into the oceans. The sea levels began to rise, slowly but relentlessly. At first, the change was imperceptible to a single generation. The tides crept a few centimeters higher each year, and the winter storms pushed the salt water a little further inland. But over centuries, the cumulative effect was immense. The low-lying plains began to shrink. Lagoons grew wider, salt marshes replaced freshwater swamps, and the mouths of the rivers became broad bays. The people who lived on the plain watched their world slip away, foot by foot. The rising waters forced a slow, generational retreat. Communities that had lived along the old river channels for centuries had to abandon their camps and move to higher ground. The landmarks that had guided their ancestors for generations, the hills, the ancient oak groves, and the burial grounds, were slowly turned into islands. Eventually, these islands too were swallowed by the gray waters of the expanding North Sea. The people had to adapt to a changing geography, learning to navigate the new waterways and estuaries. They became maritime people, building canoes from hollowed-out tree trunks and developing a deep understanding of the tides and currents. The sea was no longer a distant neighbor. It was their environment. Around 8,200 years ago, this slow process of inundation was punctuated by a sudden catastrophe. Off the coast of Norway, a massive section of the continental shelf, known as the Storegga Slide, collapsed into the deep ocean. More than 3,000 cubic kilometers of sand, mud, and rock slid down the underwater slope, triggering a giant tsunami that swept across the North Atlantic. In the open ocean, the wave was small, but as it reached the shallow waters of the North Sea, it grew into a wall of water 10 or 15 meters high. The wave rushed south, crashing into the flat coastlines of Doggerland and the eastern shores of Scotland. The impact on the low-lying plain was devastating. The wave swept across the marshes and forests, drowning everything in its path. Entire camps were washed away in minutes, and the people living in the lowlands had no warning and no escape. The tsunami stripped the soil from the land, uprooting trees and carrying massive boulders miles inland. In Scotland, the evidence of this event is still visible in the soil. Excavations along the east coast, from Shetland down to the Firth of Forth, have revealed a distinct layer of gray sand deposited by the wave, sandwiched between layers of dark peat. It is a silent record of a day when the sea rose up to claim the land. The Storegga tsunami did not destroy Doggerland completely, but it accelerated its end. The lowlands were already struggling against the rising sea, and the wave shattered the remaining barriers of sand and clay that had kept the ocean at bay. The land bridge between Britain and the continent was severed, leaving only a chain of muddy islands that grew smaller with each passing year. Within a few centuries, even these islands vanished beneath the waves, and the North Sea was complete. The connection was broken. The people who had lived on the plain were now divided, separated by miles of cold, open water. The island of Britain was born. This environmental crisis triggered a major migration. As the plain sank, the displaced populations had to find new homes. Some moved east into the European mainland, but many moved west and north, seeking the safety of the high ground. The hills and valleys of Scotland, which had once been a cold, peripheral zone, became a vital sanctuary. The rocky coastlines and steep mountains remained far above the rising waters, offering a stable environment in a drowning world. The influx of these refugees brought a dense population to the northern valleys. They did not arrive as strangers, but as people who possessed a deep knowledge of the sea and the coastal resources. They brought new skills and new traditions. This maritime heritage is visible in the archaeological record of early Scotland. Along the western and northern coasts, researchers have found massive heaps of shells, known as middens, which date to the Mesolithic period. These middens are not simple rubbish heaps. but the remains of specialized coastal settlements. They contain millions of shells of limpets, oysters, and mussels, along with the bones of seabirds, seals, and deep-sea fish. The tools found at these sites, such as bone fishhooks and antler harpoons, show a highly developed maritime technology. The people were not merely beachcombers. They were skilled sailors who navigated the rough waters of the Atlantic in skin-covered boats, traveling between the islands to gather food and materials. The memory of the lost land may have survived in the stories and songs of these coastal communities. For generations, they must have looked out over the gray waters of the North Sea and spoken of a time when their ancestors could walk across the dry ground to the east. Today, the drowned world of Doggerland still sends messages to the surface. Modern fishing trawlers working the shallow banks of the North Sea frequently pull up worked flint tools, bone harpoons, and the teeth of long-dead mammoths from the seabed. These objects are cold, wet reminders of a lost country, preserved in the dark silt of the ocean floor, linking the modern island with its continental past. The drowning of Doggerland reshaped the destiny of the North. The sea, which had once been a barrier, became the highway that connected the northern communities. The people of Scotland, isolated on their northern peninsula, developed a distinct identity that was shaped by the water. They were defined not by the land they lost, but by the shores they claimed. The high ground of the north, with its cold winds and rocky soils, became a cradle for a new way of life, built on the memory of the drowned plain and the reality of the sea. The waters had risen, but the people had climbed higher, and their stories were now written on the cliffs of the north. While the rising seas were reshaping the shores, a slower, silent transformation was taking place inland. The cliffs of the north looked down not on bare rock, but on a vast and changing green canopy that stretched from coast to coast. For thousands of years, the valleys of Scotland were covered by a forest of extraordinary density and scale. Yet, this woodland was not a static wilderness that remained untouched until the arrival of the first farmers. It was a dynamic, living system that underwent a major transition in its species, its extent, and its relationship with the human populations that lived within its shelter. The story of this great forest is the story of how the northern landscape became what it is today. In the early millennia after the ice retreated, the first trees to colonize the cold, raw soils of the north were hardy, pioneering species. Birch and hazel were the first to take root, followed by the Scots pine, which spread rapidly across the sandy soils and granite slopes. This was the era of the Great Caledonian pine forest. It was a world of dark green needles, orange-barked trunks, and a thick carpet of moss that dampened every sound. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, and the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the high canopy. These pine woods covered the hillsides, climbing high up the mountain slopes, creating a silent, vast sanctuary for the first hunter-gatherers. However, around 6,000 years ago, this coniferous world began to yield to a different kind of forest. The climate grew warmer and wetter, favoring the spread of deciduous trees. Oak, elm, ash, and alder pushed steadily northward, taking over the fertile valley bottoms and lower slopes where the soil was deepest. The pine forest was pushed higher up the mountainsides and into the poorer soils of the north and west. This new broadleaf woodland was a much richer habitat. The forest floor, lit by the filtered sunlight of spring before the leaves opened, supported a thick growth of wild garlic, bluebells, and ferns. It was a forest of hazel groves and massive oaks, whose branches spread wide over the rivers. This transition to mixed oak and hazel woods brought a significant increase in the resources available to human communities. The oak trees produced vast quantities of acorns, which drew herds of wild boar, while the hazel groves yielded harvests of nutritious nuts that could be gathered in autumn and stored for the winter months. The broadleaf forest was also home to red deer, roe deer, and wild cattle, which found shelter and food in the clearings and edge habitats. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers did not view this forest as an obstacle or a danger. It was their home, their shelter, and their primary source of food and materials. They knew every species, its uses, and its seasonal cycles. The traditional view of prehistory often describes these ancient forests as an impenetrable, frightening wilderness that humans only began to conquer with the introduction of agriculture. In this old narrative, the first farmers are pictured as heroic pioneers who cleared the wild woods to establish civilization, using their stone axes to carve out fields from the dark forest. But modern archaeological and environmental research has dismantled this myth. The forest was never a pristine wilderness. Long before the first domestic sheep or grain of wheat arrived in the north, human beings were actively modifying and managing the woodlands. They were not merely passive gatherers, but active managers of their environment, shaping the forest to suit their needs. One of the primary ways early humans managed the forest was through the practice of coppicing. This technique involves cutting trees, particularly hazel and willow, down to the ground, which stimulates them to produce a cluster of straight, flexible shoots. Over several years, these shoots grow into long poles of uniform size, which can be harvested and used for building. The cycle can be repeated indefinitely, keeping the tree in a permanent state of youthful growth. The archaeological record shows that this practice was widespread in the north. Timbers recovered from Mesolithic and Neolithic sites, preserved in the bogs, show the characteristic straight growth and cut marks of coppiced wood. These poles were essential for building roundhouse frames, fences, and fish traps. In addition to coppicing, the early inhabitants used fire to manage the forest canopy. They practiced selective burning, clearing small pockets of undergrowth and thin trees to create open glades. These clearings allowed sunlight to reach the forest floor, stimulating the growth of sweet grasses, wild berries, and hazel bushes. The tender new growth in these glades acted as a natural magnet, drawing herds of red deer and other game to the clearings where they could be hunted more easily. By creating these edge environments, the hunter-gatherers were actively increasing the productivity of the forest. The landscape was a mosaic of dense woods, open glades, and regenerating scrub, all shaped by the hand of human communities. With the transition to the Neolithic period, this management of the forest became more intensive. The tools changed. The development of polished stone axes, made of tough rocks like greenstone and pitchstone, allowed for the felling of larger trees. The sound of these axes hitting wood, a dull, rhythmic thud repeating through the valleys, marked a new phase in the history of the forest. The clearings grew larger as communities established permanent settlements and cultivated small plots of barley and wheat. The timber was used to build large communal structures and defensive enclosures. Yet, even with these larger clearings, the forest remained the dominant feature of the landscape, surrounding the small patches of agricultural land like a great green ocean. But the relationship between humans and the forest was a delicate balance, and its disruption had unexpected consequences. As clearings grew and the climate began to turn cooler and wetter around 4,000 years ago, the soil began to change. In the flat valleys and upland basins where the trees had been cleared, there were no longer deep roots to draw water from the earth and pump it back into the atmosphere through their leaves. The soil became waterlogged. The nutrients were washed down into the subsoil, leaving a cold, acidic layer at the surface. Under these wet, oxygen-deprived conditions, the sphagnum moss began to spread, initiating the slow, relentless growth of the peat bogs. In this way, the clearing of the forest was one of the factors that triggered the growth of the peat that would eventually cover the ruins of the settlements. The moss grew over the stumps of the cleared trees, sealing them in a wet tomb, where they remain preserved today. Walkers in the highlands today can often see these ancient pine and birch roots, blackened and twisted, emerging from the sides of peat cuts where the bog has been eroded by wind and water. These bog oaks and fossil pines are the silent witnesses of the forest transition, showing that the empty peatlands were once covered in dense woodland. The trees were there first. The forest did not disappear in a sudden wave of destruction, but in a slow, uneven retreat. In some areas, particularly the remote valleys of the north and the outer islands, the trees vanished early, replaced by heather moorland and bog. In other regions, the broadleaf forests survived for thousands of years, providing timber and fuel for the Bronze and Iron Age communities that succeeded the early builders. The forest was a resilient system, capable of regenerating when human pressure eased. But as the climate continued to wet and the soils grew more acidic, the balance tipped in favor of the moss, and the green canopy slowly shrank to its modern remnants. Today, only small fragments of the ancient Caledonian pine forest and the oak woods of the valleys remain, scattered across the highlands like islands of green in a sea of heather. Yet, the legacy of the great forest transition is still present in the structure of the land and the memory of its archaeology. The ancient timbers preserved in the bogs show that the people of the north were not invaders who conquered a wild wilderness, but partners who worked with the forest, learning its secrets and managing its growth. Their story was never separate from the wood, and the trees they managed still speak of their presence, preserved in the silence of the peat. While the trees of the mainland were beginning their long retreat before the rising peat, there were places where the forest had never ruled. On the windswept islands of Orkney, off the northernmost tip of the mainland, the lack of wood forced a different kind of architecture. Here, the landscape is open and flat, dominated by the constant wind from the Atlantic and the sea that is never more than a few miles away. In this treeless archipelago, the ancient inhabitants could not build their homes of timber posts and wicker walls. They had to use the only material that was abundant, the local sandstone, which splits naturally into flat, even flags. This environmental limitation became their greatest strength, turning Orkney into a laboratory of stone construction. The most famous result of this stone-building tradition is the settlement of Skara Brae, located on the west coast of the main island, overlooking the sandy curve of the Bay of Scale. For thousands of years, this village lay hidden, sealed beneath high dunes of sand that protected it from the weather. In 1850, a massive winter storm struck the islands, stripping the grass and sand from the dunes and exposing the outlines of several stone houses. What the storm revealed was not a heap of ruined walls, but a series of complete Neolithic homes, preserved so perfectly that they seem to have been abandoned only recently. The preservation was so detailed that it changed our understanding of Neolithic domestic life forever. The builders of Skara Brae designed their homes to cope with the harsh northern climate. The houses were not built on the surface of the ground, but were set into large mounds of midden, a mixture of organic waste, shells, animal bones, and ash. This midden acted as a thick layer of insulation, protecting the stone walls from the freezing winter winds and keeping the dampness out. The houses were built of double-skinned stone walls, with the space between filled with more midden material to create a draft-proof barrier. The homes were connected to one another by low, narrow passages lined with stone and roofed with flags, allowing the inhabitants to visit their neighbors without going out into the gales. Inside the houses, the layout is remarkably consistent, suggesting a shared way of life and a strict social order. Each house consists of a single large room, measuring about 6 meters by 5 meters, with a central hearth for the fire. The entrance is low, closed by a slab of stone that could be secured by a wooden bar sliding into holes in the doorposts. Opposite the entrance stands the most striking feature of the home, a large stone dresser consisting of 2 shelves supported by stone uprights. This dresser was the focal point of the house, placed where it would be lit by the fire, and was used to display the family's most valuable possessions, such as carved stone balls and polished axes. On either side of the central hearth are 2 stone box beds, built of thick slabs set on edge. The bed on the right is always larger than the one on the left, suggesting a division of space based on gender or status. These beds would have been filled with heather, bracken, or animal skins to create a warm, comfortable sleeping space. Behind the beds, small cupboards were set into the stone walls, serving as storage spaces for personal belongings. Sunk into the floor are several stone-lined tanks, their joints sealed with blue clay to make them watertight. These tanks may have been used to store fresh water, or perhaps to keep limpets and other shellfish alive before they were prepared for dinner. The atmosphere inside these Neolithic homes would have been warm and intimate, a stark contrast to the wild storms outside. The fire in the central hearth, burning peat or dried seaweed, would have filled the room with heat, light, and a thick, sweet smoke that escaped through a hole in the turf roof. The stone surfaces would have caught the flickering light of the flames, reflecting the warm glow across the room. The air would have carried the smell of roasting barley, stewing beef, and the damp earth of the surrounding midden. Sitting on the edges of the box beds, the family would have gathered around the hearth, protected from the cold and the dark by the massive stone walls. The people of Skara Brae were successful farmers and fishers. They kept herds of cattle and sheep, which grazed on the rich pasture of the islands, and they grew barley in the sandy fields nearby. They also harvested the riches of the sea, gathering limpets, mussels, and crabs from the rocky shores, and hunting seals and seabirds. The bones of cod and other deep-sea fish show that they were capable of fishing in the open waters of the Atlantic, probably using small boats made of skins stretched over a wooden frame. Their diet was varied and abundant, supported by the fertile soils and rich marine life of the Orkney archipelago. They were not merely surviving, they were thriving. The material culture of Skara Brae is rich and complex. The inhabitants used pottery of a style known as grooved ware, decorated with incised geometric patterns, which was used for cooking and storage. They also carved objects of bone and stone, including fine bone pins for clothing, stone bead necklaces, and mysterious carved stone balls. These balls, decorated with raised knobs and complex spirals, are unique to Scotland and must have held a significant ritual or social meaning. The quality of these objects shows that the people had the time and skill to create items of beauty and complexity, reflecting a society that valued craftsmanship and symbolic expression. The objects were part of their identity. For a long time, historians viewed Skara Brae and the other prehistoric sites of Orkney as remote outposts, isolated from the developments of southern Britain. It was assumed that the islands were a peripheral zone, where new ideas arrived late and in a simplified form. But recent excavations have overturned this view, showing that Orkney was actually a cultural powerhouse during the Neolithic period. The islands were home to a dense and highly organized population that was building some of the largest and most sophisticated monuments in Europe. The Ness of Brodgar, a massive complex of stone buildings located a few miles from Skara Brae, was a major ritual center that drew people from across Britain. This Orcadian crucible was a place of intense innovation. The grooved ware pottery style, which became the dominant pottery type across the whole of Britain, was actually invented in Orkney before spreading south to England and Ireland. The ideas developed in Orkney, from stone architecture to ritual practices, had a lasting influence on the wider Neolithic world. The sea was not a barrier that isolated the islands, but a highway that connected them to a vast maritime trade network. Boats from Orkney traveled south along the western coast of Scotland, carrying stone, pottery, and ideas to the Hebrides, Ireland, and beyond. The edge of the map was the center of innovation. The preservation of Skara Brae allows us to bridge the gap of 5,000 years and feel a connection with the people who lived there. The stone furniture, the beds, the dresser, and the hearth are all familiar elements of a home, showing that the basic needs of family life have changed very little. The layout of the houses, which remained virtually unchanged for over 600 years, shows a society that valued stability and tradition. The village was not abandoned in a sudden catastrophe, as was once thought. Instead, the rising sand dunes slowly made the houses uninhabitable, forcing the residents to move their homes elsewhere, leaving their stone furniture in the care of the dunes. As we look out over the ruins of Skara Brae today, with the waves crashing against the stone seawall and the wind blowing off the bay, the connection with the past feels immediate. The stone houses have outlasted the timber structures of the mainland, keeping the memory of their builders alive in a treeless world. The Orcadian crucible showed that limitations can lead to extraordinary achievements, turning sandstone flags into a monument of domestic life that has stood for 50 centuries. The sandstone remains firm, a record of a community that built its world of stone, and whose stories still whisper from the empty hearths of the north. The whispers from the hearths of Skara Brae are echoed on a much grander scale just a few miles to the southeast, on a narrow strip of land that separates two large bodies of water. This is the sacred Isthmus of Orkney, a finger of earth flanked by the saltwater Loch of Stenness on one side and the freshwater Loch of Herray on the other. Today, this ridge is dominated by two giant monuments, the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness. For centuries, antiquarians believed these circles were isolated sites built in a largely empty landscape. But in 2003, excavations on the ridge between the circles exposed a discovery that redefined the Neolithic world. This was the Ness of Brodgar, a massive complex of monumental stone buildings. The Ness of Brodgar was not a typical farming village like Skara Brae, but a vast sanctuary, a center of assembly and ritual that was used for over 1,000 years. The entire complex was enclosed by a massive stone wall, known to researchers as the Great Wall of Brodgar, which was over 4 meters wide and stood several meters high. This wall ran across the width of the peninsula, creating a physical barrier that separated the sacred sanctuary from the everyday world outside. Anyone entering the Ness had to pass through a narrow gate in this wall, stepping into a paved precinct filled with monumental stone halls. The scale of the construction was unlike anything else built in Britain at the time. The buildings within the sanctuary were massive, constructed of finely dressed sandstone blocks laid with great precision. The walls were double-skinned, up to 4 meters thick, and the interiors were paved with smooth stone flags. Unlike the simple dwellings of Skara Brae, these structures had high roofs, probably made of timber frames covered with heavy stone tiles. Several of these tiles, shaped into neat diamonds and rectangles with holes drilled for wooden pegs, have been recovered from the ruins. To support the weight of these heavy stone roofs, The builders constructed massive stone piers inside the halls, creating a series of alcoves and bays around a central open floor. The architecture was designed to impress. The largest and most impressive structure in the complex is known simply as Structure 10. Measuring 25 meters long and 20 meters wide, this building has been described as a Neolithic cathedral. Its walls were built of massive blocks of yellow and red sandstone, carefully chosen to create a contrasting pattern of colors. Inside the hall, a series of stone-lined hearths were placed along the central axis, while the walls were decorated with hundreds of examples of incised art. There are carvings of cup marks, nested diamonds, and crisscross lines that catch the light of the fires. The interior was a place of darkness and shadow, where the flickering flames illuminated the decorated stone surfaces. Perhaps the most surprising discovery at the Ness of Brodgar was that the stone walls were not plain, but painted. Excavators recovered fragments of plaster and stone slabs that still retained traces of red, yellow, and black pigments. These pigments, made from ground iron ore and charcoal mixed with animal fat, were applied directly to the stone surfaces to create colorful geometric designs. This find shattered the traditional image of a gray, monochrome prehistory. The halls of the Ness were vibrant and colorful, filled with bright patterns that would have glowed in the firelight. Entering these dark spaces, with the colorful walls reflecting the flames and the smoke rising toward the rafters, would have been a powerful sensory experience. The Ness of Brodgar was a place of gathering, drawing people from across Orkney and far beyond for massive communal assemblies. The evidence for these gatherings is preserved in the soil around the buildings, particularly around Structure 10. Excavators discovered a massive deposit of animal bones, representing the remains of at least 400 cattle. Analysis of the bones showed that all these animals were slaughtered and consumed in a single, short-lived event, a gargantuan feast that must have drawn thousands of people to the peninsula. This feast was not just a local celebration. It was a major social and political event, where alliances were forged and shared beliefs were reinforced through the sharing of food. Scientific analysis of the cattle teeth has revealed that the animals were not raised on the surrounding farms of the peninsula. Many of them had been brought from the outer islands of the Orkney archipelago, and some had even traveled from the Scottish mainland, crossing the rough waters of the Pentland Firth. This means the Ness of Brodgar was a pilgrimage center of regional and national significance, attracting travelers from hundreds of miles away. These pilgrims did not arrive empty-handed. They brought their finest livestock, their local traditions, and exotic goods to trade, making the Ness a hub of cultural exchange. The isolation of these ancient communities was an illusion. The imported goods found at the Ness confirmed the existence of these long-distance trade networks. Among the ruins, researchers recovered fragments of pitchstone, a volcanic glass that looks like obsidian. The nearest source of pitchstone is the Isle of Arran, located off the southwest coast of Scotland, over 200 miles to the south. The presence of this material in Orkney shows that Neolithic traders were navigating the sea routes along the western coast of Scotland, exchanging valuable materials across vast distances. Other finds include polished stone axes made of green stone from the English Lake District and flint tools from Yorkshire, showing that Orkney was connected to a network that spanned the entire island of Britain. This complex network of trade and pilgrimage challenges the idea that Neolithic society was simple and fragmented. Building and maintaining the Ness of Brodgar required an extraordinary level of organization and cooperation. It was a project that spanned generations, requiring a surplus of food to feed the builders, skilled stonemasons to shape the sandstone, and a stable social structure to plan the work. The Ness shows that these ancient people were capable of coordinating labor on a scale that was previously thought to be impossible for this era. They were part of a highly integrated society, bound together by a shared belief system and a network of political and economic connections. The Ness of Brodgar was also a place of ritual and symbolic power. The development of the sanctuary on the narrow isthmus, separating the saltwater loch from the freshwater loch, was deliberate. In many ancient belief systems, water represents a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The Ness, suspended between the two waters, was a liminal space, a bridge between different realms. The two stone circles that flank the complex may have represented different stages in a ritual journey, with the stones of Stennis, associated with hearths and domestic life, on one side, and the ring of Brodgar, associated with burials and the ancestors, on the other. After more than 1,000 years of use, the Ness of Brodgar was deliberately closed and decommissioned. This closure was not a sudden catastrophe or the result of a violent invasion, but a planned, ritual abandonment. Around 2300 BC, the hearths of Structure 10 were extinguished for the last time. The stone walls were partially dismantled, and the massive stone roofs were taken down. Before the site was covered, a final ceremony was held. The bones of the 400 cattle were deposited around the ruins of Structure 10, along with broken pottery and stone tools, creating a physical boundary that sealed the sacred space. The sanctuary was returned to the earth. Today, the excavations at the Ness of Brodgar are slowly revealing the outlines of this Neolithic sanctuary. The stone walls, the painted plaster, and the bones of the feasts have survived in the soil, keeping the memory of this ancient pilgrimage center alive. The Ness has shown us that prehistoric Orkney was not a remote outpost on the edge of the world, but a vibrant center of innovation and connection, whose influence was felt across Britain. The stones of the isthmus remain silent witnesses to a time when the high ground of the north was a place of assembly where people gathered between the waters to write their stories in stone. The stories written in the stone halls of Orkney were stories of a stable, cooperative world. For centuries, the communities of the north had worked together to build open monuments and gather for shared feasts. But as the centuries turned and the climate began to cool, that cooperative world faced a difficult challenge. Around 3,500 years ago, the environment of northern Europe deteriorated significantly. A long period of heavy rainfall and cooling temperatures set in, turning the fertile soils of the highlands and islands acidic and waterlogged. The peat bogs, which had been growing slowly, expanded rapidly, swallowing up the old agricultural fields and forcing people off the hills. The resources that had supported a large population were shrinking, and the old stability began to fracture. This climate collapse created intense pressure on the surviving farming communities. With fertile land becoming scarce, competition for resources grew fierce. The open, undefended settlements of the Neolithic, such as Skara Brae, were no longer safe or practical. The architecture of the north had to adapt to a more fragmented and competitive world. Instead of raising open stone circles and communal tombs that celebrated the cooperation of the valley, the builders turned their skills toward defense, protection, and the assertion of status. The landscape, which had once been defined by spaces of assembly, became a landscape of fortresses. The people of the north were preparing for a harder era. The most spectacular expression of this new architectural focus was the broch, a type of monumental dry stone tower unique to Scotland. Built during the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, brochs are found in their hundreds across the far north and the Western Islands, particularly in Caithness, Sutherland, Orkney, and Shetland. Rising up to 12 meters against the wind, these round towers looked like modern cooling towers, with thick walls that tapered slightly as they rose. They were built entirely without mortar, using only the weight of the sandstone and schist blocks to keep them standing. The engineering of these towers was sophisticated, representing a peak of dry stone building technology. The design of a broch was a marvel of prehistoric engineering. The walls were double-skinned, consisting of an outer wall and an inner wall connected by stone slabs at regular intervals. This hollow construction was both light and incredibly strong, allowing the towers to reach great heights without collapsing under their own weight. Inside the hollow space between the walls, the builders constructed a series of stone galleries and winding stairs that led to the upper levels. These galleries acted as structural supports and also provided extra storage space and sleeping quarters protected from the elements. The only entrance to the tower was a single, low doorway, which could be closed by a thick oak slab and barricaded with a wooden beam sliding into the masonry. Inside the tower, the central space was divided into functional areas. A large hearth occupied the center of the flagstone floor, providing heat and light for the occupants. Around the walls, stone partitions created alcoves that were used for cooking, sleeping, and storage, while a wooden gallery level, supported by a projecting ledge of stone known as a scarsement, ran around the upper half of the room. Many brochs also featured a deep well dug directly into the rock floor, ensuring a secure supply of fresh water in times of siege. The interior was dry, insulated by the thick double walls, and relatively warm, providing a safe haven for the family and their most valuable livestock. Entering a broch on a winter evening would have been a powerful sensory experience. The central fire, fed by peat and driftwood, would have cast long shadows across the curved sandstone walls, while the smoke rose toward the high wooden roof. The air would have carried the smell of roasted meat, wet wool, and the damp earth of the floor. From the upper galleries, the voices of children and the scraping of tools would have echoed down into the main chamber, while the sound of the wind screamed outside, unable to penetrate the thick stone walls. Inside this fortress of stone, the family was protected, insulated from the hostile environment and the dangers of the night. Traditional histories have often described the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze and Iron Ages as a complete break with the past, suggesting that the arrival of metalworking marked the end of the old stone-building cultures. In this simple view, the new metal tools allowed people to build in timber, and the old skills of stonemasonry were forgotten. But the brochs of the north counter this assumption, showing a direct continuity of dry stone architecture. The skills that had been developed at Skara Brae and the Ness of Brodgar were not lost. Instead, they were refined and adapted to a new purpose, demonstrating that the ancient builders were capable of evolving their traditions to meet new challenges. The introduction of bronze and iron tools did not replace stone, but allowed it to be worked with greater precision. The builders could shape the sandstone blocks more easily, creating tighter joints and more stable structures. The core technology, however, remained the dry stone wall, showing that the physical relationship between the people and the local geology was unbroken. The brochs were not a foreign design imported from the south, but an indigenous development that grew out of the unique conditions of the northern islands. They were the ultimate expression of a maritime stone culture that had survived the climate collapse. The function of these towers has been a subject of debate among historians for decades. For a long time, they were viewed simply as military bunkers built by local warlords to defend their territories against invaders. But recent excavations have shown that their role was more complex. Brochs were the homes of the local elites, the families who controlled the remaining fertile land in the valleys. Their height made them visible for miles across the flat moors and coastlines, acting as symbols of prestige and power. A family living in a broch was proclaiming its wealth and its ability to mobilize labor, asserting its status in a competitive world. The towers were landmarks of authority. At the same time, the brochs served as community hubs in times of crisis. When raiders approached the valley to steal cattle or capture prisoners, the surrounding farmers would flee to the tower, bringing their livestock with them into the central courtyard. The thick walls and narrow entrance made the broch virtually impregnable to the weapons of the era. A small group of defenders standing on the upper galleries could easily pelt attackers with stones and spears, keeping them at bay until help arrived. The tower was a sanctuary for the whole community, a physical expression of the mutual dependence between the elite families and the farmers who worked the land. The survival of so many broch ruins across the northern landscape shows their strength. In some areas, such as the valley of Dunbeath in Caithness, multiple towers were built along the river, within sight of one another, forming a defensive network that monitored the movements of people and livestock. These ruins are still dominant features of the landscape today, rising like gray stumps from the green pasture and heather. Their massive stones have withstood centuries of winter storms, keeping the memory of this defensive era alive. They stand in silence, keeping their secrets from the modern world, reminding us of a time when survival required a fortress. The brochs represent the final, monument-building phase of the prehistoric North. As the climate continued to wet and the peat bogs expanded, the resources of the land grew even scarcer, and the society that had built these towers began to change. But the towers themselves remained, standing against the gray sky as symbols of resilience. The builders had faced a changing environment and a fracturing world, and they had answered with stone, raising fortresses that outlasted their own names. Their stories were no longer written in open avenues of assembly, but in the thick, windowless walls of these silent sentinels, which still watched the windswept shores of the north. The sentinel towers of the brochs stood for centuries, but like all creations of human hands, their dominance eventually came to an end. As the Iron Age advanced, the social forces that had demanded these massive fortresses began to change. Around 2,000 years ago, the need to build towering stone cylinders declined. The reasons for this shift remain uncertain, but it suggests a change in the political structure of the North, perhaps with the rise of larger tribal alliances that reduced the level of local warfare between neighboring valleys. The brochs were not abandoned to the elements, but were modified to suit a new way of life. The high walls were partially dismantled, and the stone was reused to build smaller, more comfortable dwellings around their bases. These new dwellings, often known as wheelhouses due to their internal radial partitions that resembled the spokes of a wheel, represent a shift from defensive prestige to domestic comfort. Built of dry stone and set into the ground, or clustered around the ruins of the old towers, wheelhouses were smaller and easier to heat than the massive brochs. Inside, the radial walls created a series of cozy bays around a central hearth, providing private spaces for family life. The builders no longer felt the need to project their power high into the sky. Instead, they chose to live close to the earth, protected by the shelter of the old stone walls. The era of the monument was giving way to the era of the village. Yet, as the society changed, the connection to the ancient past remained strong. The Iron Age communities did not ignore the massive monuments left behind by the Neolithic and Bronze Age builders. Instead, they maintained a complex, active relationship with these prehistoric structures, viewing them as sacred links to the ancestors. Archaeologists have found clear evidence that ancient stone circles and chambered cairns were reused and visited for centuries. Iron Age people returned to these sites, not to destroy them, but to perform rituals, leave offerings, and bury their dead. The old monuments were not viewed as dead relics, but as living landmarks that validated their connection to the land. This reuse of ancient sites is particularly visible at chambered cairns like Maeshowe in Orkney. Built 3,000 years before, these stone chambers were still accessible during the Iron Age and early historic period. Visitors entered the dark, quiet chambers, leaving behind graffiti carved into the sandstone walls and placing their own burials near the ancient tombs. By placing their dead in the shadow of the stones built by the ancestors, they were claiming a direct lineage and inheritance, linking their own short lives with the eternal cycle of the past. The monuments acted as anchors for their identity, providing a sense of continuity in a changing world. In some cases, the reuse was more practical but still carrying symbolic weight. At several stone circles across the highlands, Iron Age metalworkers set up their hearths and workshops within the ancient stone rings. To the modern mind, using a sacred circle as a workshop might seem disrespectful, but for the ancient smiths, the association may have been different. Metalworking was viewed as a semi-magical process, a transformation of rock into iron carried out with fire and skill. By conducting this work within the stone circle, the smiths may have been calling upon the power of the ancestors to bless their craft, turning the ancient temple into a place of transformation. The tradition of building in stone did not die with the brochs, but took on smaller, more personal forms. During the late Iron Age, the focus of stone construction shifted from massive communal projects to individual markers. Single standing stones, often carved with simple symbols or lines, were raised along boundaries, paths, and graves. These stones were not meant to be seen from miles away like the brochs, but were intimate markers of personal memory or territorial limits. In the north and east, this tradition eventually evolved into the carved stones of the Picts, featuring complex symbols of animals, mirrors, and crescents, whose meanings still challenge modern interpretation. The story of stone was still being written. The Pictish symbol stones represent the final phase of this ancient northern stone tradition, bridging the gap between prehistory and the written records of the Middle Ages. These stones, carved with incredible skill using iron chisels on hard granite and sandstone, show a continuity of craftsmanship that stretches back to the Neolithic. The symbols themselves, though new, were placed on standing stones that shared the same physical qualities as the megaliths of Callanish and Stenness. The relationship between the people, the stone, and the landscape remained central to their culture, a thread of continuity that survived the rise and fall of different societies and the changing of the climate. When we look back across the vast span of northern prehistory, we see a story that is far richer and more complex than old models allowed. It is not a narrative of primitive nomads slowly learning to copy the ideas of the South, but of a highly innovative, resilient people who shaped their environment and created their own unique traditions. From the Mesolithic calendar of Warren Field, tracking the solstices 10,000 years ago, to the stone circle of Callanish, the preserved houses of Skara Brae, the painted halls of the Ness of Brodgar, and the towers of the brochs, the North was a cradle of engineering and astronomical observation. This history was shaped by the unique geography of the North, a landscape of rocky coasts, steep hills, and wind-swept islands. The lack of timber on the islands forced the builders to work in stone, creating a physical record that has survived for thousands of years, while the damp climate and the growth of the peat bogs preserved the organic details of their daily lives. The highlands and islands are not an empty wilderness, but a layered archive of human effort, where every hillside and valley holds the remnants of those who lived here before us. The empty moors are filled with the silent signatures of the builders, written in stone and peat. The people who built these monuments did not disappear. Their descendants continued to live in the valleys, farming the same soils, fishing the same seas, and passing down the stories of the land from generation to generation. The language changed, the tools changed, and new beliefs arrived. But the physical connection to the landscape remained unbroken. Today, the standing stones still catch the pale northern light. The buried walls still run beneath the heather, and the brochs still watch the sea, keeping their silent vigil. They are not merely monuments of the dead. They are reminders of the resilience of life in a challenging world. As the sun sets over the western hills, casting long shadows from the standing stones of Callanish across the peat plains, the landscape returns to its natural silence. The wind blows off the Atlantic, rustling the heather and the dry grass, carrying the cold, wet air of the northern night. In this quiet hour, the boundaries between the past and the present feel thin. The stones stand as they have stood for 5,000 years, weathered by storms and warmed by the summer sun, keeping the memory of the builders alive in a world that has forgotten their names. They are the anchors of the land. The story of prehistoric Scotland is a story of stone, water, and time, of a people who looked at the wind-swept hills and the rising seas and chose to stay, leaving their mark in the very bones of the earth. Their monuments stand in silence, waiting for us to look down and read the archive of their lives. Preserved in the dark bogs and the sandy dunes of the north, the journey through this ancient history is not a search for a lost world, but a return to a landscape that has always remembered its builders, keeping their secrets safe under the moss and the tides, until we are ready to listen. Now, as the stories of the stone builders fade into the quiet of the room, let the mind rest. The ancient circles, the buried walls, and the towers of the north are safe in the dark, kept by the earth and the silence of the hills. The long journeys of the hunters, the farmers, and the builders are finished. The winds that blew across the outer Hebrides and the waves that crashed against Skara Brae are only distant sounds now, blending with the quiet rhythm of the night. There is nothing more to follow, no new paths to trace, and no more secrets to seek. The history of the north is complete for tonight, wrapped in the cool mist that settles over the silent valleys. Let the blankets feel warm and heavy. Let the breath become slow and steady, matching the quiet rhythm of the hills that have stood for millions of years. As the stars shine over the dark peaks and the sea rolls in silence, let the day drift away completely. The stones of Lewis stand in the dark, keeping their long vigil, but the watchers are asleep. The fields are quiet, the hearths are cold, and the fire has gone out. Let yourself sink into the blankets, letting go of the words and the images. The earth holds the memory of all those who came before, keeping them safe in the damp soil and the cold bogs, and now it offers that same quiet protection to this room. There is only the soft darkness, the warm bed, and the deep, silent rest of the ancient land. Let the sleep come, gentle and deep, as the night covers the hills. Is greater than, is greater than, is greater than. End of script. Sleep well.